Well, good morning. Good to see everybody. If you would be opening your Bibles to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, we're going to pick up our study in verse 6 this morning. Romans 13 and verse 6. Danny Brown, would you lead us in a word of prayer to start our class?
Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this opportunity that we have together in thy name. This opportunity we have to study thy word. Thankful, Lord, for all the blessings you've given us throughout this week and throughout our life. Remembering that all good things come from thee. Pray for those that are less fortunate than we are, those that are struggling in life, those that are struggling with illness. So thankful for the love that you have for us. Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, last Sunday you may remember that we started looking at chapter 13, talking about this concept of being subject to governing authorities, those who have those types of civil or political authorities over the cities, the regions, the countries, what have you, that we are citizens of. And we talked about some of the reasons why we are to be subject to those authorities. We talked about the fact that God is the one who has granted that authority. But we also talked just briefly about the fact that even though we're told we are to be subject to those authorities, and even though that authority has been given by God, that does not mean that that authority cannot be abused. That does not mean that there are never going to be tyrants. There's never going to be those who are going to use that authority in ways that it was not intended. But what we discussed last week and where we concluded our lesson was, as children of God, we are bound to honor those authority figures in those areas that do not go against the will of God. Now, one of the questions that we did touch on and that we will get into a little bit more this morning is, what if you have someone who is in a position of authority and they are imposing things that are contrary to the will of God? Does that mean we completely reject that person's authority? Or do we submit to their authority in the term I used last week, in those legitimate matters, those things that are appropriate, and reject their authority in the things that are incorrect, that are unbiblical? Or is there to be just a complete blanket rejection? You know, this person has done one thing, they stand opposed to God's will in this one area, therefore I'm not going to submit to that. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what we need to understand, and what we're going to see as we come into this next section of verses, there were some in the first century who had come to this mindset that if those governing authorities are trying to promote things or endorse things that are contrary to the will of God, then we do not have to submit to them in any way. And we see the way that this is going to be taught by Paul, the way it's being promoted. And we know that Jesus as well addressed this in his teaching, was from the standpoint of paying taxes. They had developed this ideology, some of the Romans had, especially those who had become Christians. Well, the Roman Empire, you know, they're opposed to Christianity. They're idol worshipers. They're engaging in all of these sinful activities. Therefore, we don't have to submit to the things that they try to get us to do. We don't have to pay those taxes. We don't have to give allegiance to Caesar. We don't have to do any of those things because, you know, they are doing things that are sinful, so we don't have to accept that. Well, if you look at verses 6 and 7, notice how Paul addresses this subject. He says, "For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. Well, this is going back, as we discussed last week, to this concept of those authority figures being those who are God's ministers. They are the ones who are to be executing this authority in a godly fashion, the way that God had instructed them to do. You look there in verse 4, for he is God's minister to you for good. We talked about the fact that if someone is using that authority in an appropriate fashion, those who are doing those things that are right shouldn't have anything to worry about. Because those who have been given this authority, to use the terminology that's used here, they're not going to bear the sword in vain. They're not going to hand down unjust punishments. They're not going to do things that are going to impose pressures upon their people. They're going to do what's right, what is acceptable. But now we come to this concept and we find that there was this ideology. There was this ideology that had developed, and first it had developed among the Jews. Now we understand from reading the Old Testament, especially the passages dealing with the law of Moses, that there were certain taxes that the Jews were expected to pay each year. They generally came to be known as the temple tax. And they would have to go to Jerusalem generally during the time of the Passover, and they would make those contributions to that temple tax. Well, over time, there came to be tax collectors who would go around into different areas, and for those who were not able to travel to Jerusalem to pay that tax, then they were able to collect in that form. But then, as the Jews came under the authority of the Romans then came in, and they started trying to impose their own taxes upon the people. Well, the Jews, you may remember, we've talked about this before, they had an agreement with the Romans that so long as they essentially submitted to the authority of Caesar, they could operate as a separate entity. They were able to have their Sanhedrin council that overseen their affairs. Now, certainly anything that was major, it had to go before the Romans. And so they began to develop this mindset, well, we're Jews and we pay the temple tax. That's the tax that we have to pay. So now why, since the Romans have come in, why would we also have to then pay a tax to them? Why would we have to basically be double taxed? Well, we don't ever see that happening today, do we? Well, sure. There are still many times where we see that type of situation taking place. But then now, you had those who were residents of Rome, Paul writing to those residents, and apparently some of them had developed this mindset that if anyone was doing things contrary to the will of God, you did not have to submit to that authority. You didn't have to contribute to the taxes they imposed and things of that nature. Well, you remember in the example of Jesus, when he was confronted about paying the tax, what did he tell Peter to do? Do you remember? He said, you go out and you catch a fish. And the story goes, he tells Peter, you open the mouth of the fish, there you'll find 1 shekel. You take that shekel and you go and you pay both your and my temple tax. So he was indicating that, yes, you still are to submit to that authority. But then on another passage, in another place, we find Jesus being asked about rendering to Caesar, paying these Roman taxes. And you remember the statement that he made there, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's. And so this is talking about the fact that just because we may not agree with everything they stand for, just because we may not even agree with everything that those taxes are going to support. I can tell you from the outset, there are things that our tax dollars go to support that I don't agree with. Now, we're not going to get into specifics because this is not the time or the place for that. But coming back to this point that's being made here, we have chosen to be residents of this country. We've chosen to be residents of this county, of this city, this state. And as a result of that, due to the choice that we've made, we are bound to submit to those authorities that are in place, and we pay the taxes that are imposed. If we don't like it, we have the right to go somewhere else. We have the right to go through the proper channels and try to change those things. But those are not matters that stand opposed to the will of God. And so looking at what Paul says, he starts out by acknowledging the fact that we are to render therefore to all their due. If there is something that you owe someone, and in this case it's talking about a government authority, if there's something that you owe someone, pay it. Pay it. Take care of your debts. But then he says, taxes to whom taxes are due. If there's taxes that you, by the authority of those that you are submitting to, if they have imposed a tax, pay it. But then notice he also mentions this, customs to whom customs. One of the best ways that I saw this explained, at least in a way that would make the best sense in our situation today, when it says to pay taxes to whom taxes are due, this would be something like our income taxes. You know, we pay income taxes to the federal government. We pay income taxes to the state government. This idea of customs, this would be something more along the lines of a sales tax or a tariff. That's a term we hear a lot today. This is something that we pay to be able to access certain goods. Well, this is something that has been around for generations, as far back as the first century and before. He says, if it's something that's there that you're being told that you have to pay, it doesn't go against the will of God, pay it. This is not something that Christians are to argue against, to fight against. If it's there and it's not unjust, submit to it. Go along with it. And then he mentions fear to whom fear, which essentially, I prefer to use the term respect. You know, give respect to whom respect is due. You know, the way that I've always been taught is it doesn't matter if you agree with someone wholeheartedly or not. If that person is in a position of authority, respect that person. No, you may not respect the man or the woman, but you respect the office. You respect the authority. And we can apply this in so many different ways. We can apply this to, people respecting authority figures such as police officers, people respecting authorities such as, we could even bring it down out of government affairs. You respect those who are teachers in the classroom. You respect those who are your bosses in the workplace, things of that nature. You respect the position. You respect the authority. It doesn't mean you're always going to agree with the person, but you respect that authority. You give respect to whom respect is due. And then honor to whom honor. Now this, I think that the reason that Paul mentions these two terms separately is because sometimes we give respect to people who are not deserving of honor. We give respect. Christians were expected to give respect to Caesar. Were the Caesars honorable people? They were far from it. Yes, sir.
We're supposed to give double honor to the elder.
That's right. That's right. And so when we think about this concept of honor, we give honor to someone. And when I look at that, yes, we respect someone, we treat someone with respect. But when we shower someone with honor, we're doing that because they are using their authority in the right way. And like William said, the Bible says we are to give elders double honor. Well, folks, if an elder is truly executing his position in a proper fashion, I can't think of another person on the face of this earth who is more deserving of honor. And so, what Paul is trying to help us to see here is that just because you're Christians, just because you may stand opposed to certain things, that does not mean that you have the right to reject everyone and everything that you stand opposed to. We have to submit. We have to submit. All right, any questions or comments up to that point? Right, just those who are older, those, and certainly, and it comes back to the whole concept. We teach our children to say yes, sir, yes, ma'am. We treat older people with respect, and that comes back as well to this concept of yes, we treat them with respect. We don't necessarily treat them with honor, but we treat them with respect, and so. I believe that that's the reason why Paul mentions these two things separately, because we can respect someone without honoring that person. But ideally, those who are in positions of authority, they should be individuals who are honorable. They should be people that we are able to give both respect and honor to. But that's not always the case. Okay, let's move now down into this next section. As we come into verses 8 through 10, we're going to find Paul using this same type of terminology, using this same imagery that he's been using here to now remove this from the standpoint of governing authorities to now he's going to apply this to every person. He's going to apply this to our neighbors. And so let's look at this section of verses. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, all are summed up namely in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. He starts out by talking about this concept of owing no one anything. And one of the things that I often look at, we go back especially into the book of Proverbs, and Solomon has a lot to say about becoming indebted to another person. Things such as co-signing, loaning money, things of that nature to people. But also, we can look at this strictly from the standpoint of debts that we incur. We go out here in the community, as we go through this life, we're going to have bills we have to pay. We're going to have debts that we're going to incur. And it's our responsibility to find a way to take care of that. And so whenever we begin thinking about this concept of owe no one anything, he's talking about the fact that debt is something that often causes harm. Debt is something that often strains relationships. Debt is something that can cause a lot of issues that are not necessarily things that man needs to be having to deal with in life. He goes on to say the only thing that we need to be indebted to another in regard to is love. The debt that we are to owe to one another is to love one another. Yes, sir.
A lot of times we see sinners and we avoid them, but you're supposed to love them too. You just don't love the sin.
That's right. That's right. So whenever we think about this concept, as we go through life, and I've seen situations, I know you've seen situations as well, where people will go around, they'll go in the community, they'll borrow a lot of money, they'll borrow money from their brothers and sisters in Christ, and then they either don't pay it back, they skip town, they make excuses why they can't pay it back, things of that nature. Does this produce goodwill in that person, or does that produce harm? It hurts that person's reputation. It can hurt the reputation of the church. Now, something that I want us to understand. I know that there are some people, there are some members of the church, there are some financial advisors today who promote this idea of never going into any kind of debt whatsoever. Folks, that would be wonderful if it was possible. But it's not always possible. What this is talking about, and the way that I have always interpreted this, if you differ with me, that's fine. Please share. But I've always looked at this as unnecessary debt. debt that you enter into that you didn't have to enter into, or possibly even debt that you entered into agreeing to pay back and then you never, or you agreed to pay it back but never actually intended to go through with it? It's not talking about legitimate debts that arise. Because you stop and think about it. How many of us at the end of every month owe the electric company money? Every one of us. How many of us owe a gas company, or we owe a water company, or we owe a cell phone company? We have certain debts that just naturally are incurred. What do? We pay those bills when they come in. We take care of it. That's not the kind of debt that this is talking about. There's probably very few of us here today that if we had to buy a new house could just go out and write a check for it. There's probably very few of us that if we had to go out and buy a new car, we would be able to go out and just write a check for that car. There are certain debts that have to be incurred at different times. But this is talking about the way that we handle the debts that we have. Are we going through with the agreements that have been made? Are we meeting those payments? Are we making sure that we are satisfying those things that arise? If so, then that's not what Paul's talking about. Paul's talking about running up debt and not paying it back. Running it up and not having any intention of paying it back. I knew a man one time, and at the time that I knew him, he had filed bankruptcy 6 times. And it wasn't because he didn't have the ability to pay his debts. It was because he desired to live above his means. And so he would go out, he would run up vast amounts of credit card debt, and then every few years, however often he could, he would file bankruptcy. Bankruptcy laws are there for a reason. They are there to be used for legitimate things. But they are not there to be used to cancel the debts of people that have entered into those things frivolously. That's what Paul's talking about. He's talking about these situations to where we've taken steps that we didn't necessarily have to take, and we've got ourselves in a situation to where it can cause issues, it can harm the relationships that we have. And so he says our mentality should be that the only thing that we become indebted to another person with is love. Now, one way that we can apply that, if I go out here and I borrow $100 from Wayne Penn, if I truly love Wayne, I'm going to make sure I pay him that money back. The love that we have for each other dictates the way that we treat one another. It dictates the way that we handle every situation of life that comes along. You look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it tells us very plainly, if we have love, we have what? No, if we do not have love, I forgot a word there. If we do not have love, we're nothing. In God's eyes, we're nothing. Now, if we have love, that chapter gives us a lot of things that we have. Things that are a part of our character. But notice it says, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. You know, something that I've often said, Jesus tells us that the 2 greatest commands in the law, what are they? You all know what they are. The 2 greatest commands in the law. Someone tell me. The first is what? Love God. And what's the second? Love your neighbor as yourself. Everything that we face in this life falls under one of those categories. It applies in some way either to the love we have for God or the love we have for our fellow man. Well, look at the way that Paul addresses it here. He draws their minds all the way back to the 10 Commandments. He says, all of these things are based upon love. Because you look at it, he says, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. Folks, if we truly love God and we truly love our fellow man, are we going to engage in any of those things? No. But then he also says, and if there is any other commandment, all are summed up in this statement. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because the next statement, love does no harm. Yes, sir.
Who is your neighbor?
Everybody's our neighbor, Don. Everybody is our neighbor. Yes. Now, to the Jews, Jesus had to address that. The Jews, they believed that only fellow Jews were their neighbors. And if we were going to apply that, then we would say, well, you know what? Fellow Christians are the only neighbors we have. Jesus says, no, that's not the way it is. Everybody is our neighbor. And that kind of goes back to what was mentioned earlier, the fact that, there may be people that we come into contact with that are living very sinful lives. We may not like the person that they are at that point, but that doesn't mean that we do not love that person's soul, that we do not love that individual and want them to straighten up their life. Why? Because they are our neighbor. We're to love our neighbor as ourselves. And love does no harm to a neighbor. Now, I always chuckle a little bit whenever I hear people make the statement, tough love. I think there's probably a better way to define that. Sometimes the love that we show for another person, it has to be presented in a very pointed fashion. It has to be presented in such a way that people know that we love them, but we do not endorse the way that they're living. But I have always been of the disposition that any matter that we have to address, regardless of how severe it may be, we can address those things with love. We can address those matters from the standpoint, you know what, I don't agree with the way you're living your life. It's contrary to the will of God, but I love you. I want what's best for you. I want you to get your life right. There are ways that we can show love for each and every person that we come into contact with. It may not always be easy. It may be difficult at times to find qualities in those individuals that we love. But when it comes down to it, each and every person has a soul. Each and every person has the ability to become a child of God. And the love that we have for each and every person should motivate us to love those people. Not support the things they're doing, but love those people. Because love, as it says, does no harm to a neighbor. If we truly love like we're supposed to, we're not going to do anything that might hurt another person. We're not going to do anything that might, in some way, produce hatred, produce hard feelings, what have you. Now, we can't control the way that another person reacts to the things that we do. We may come to a person in as loving a fashion as we possibly can, and that person take it the wrong way. We cannot control the way that another person is going to react. All we can do is control the way that we approach that situation. And we need to make sure that it's with love. Because as this says, love is the fulfillment of the law. If we truly love God and we truly love our fellow man, are we going to live a faithful Christian life? You bet. If we truly love God, we truly love our fellow man, are we going to have a good reputation? You bet. Are we going to have, like we talked about last Sunday morning, are we going to let that light of Christian influence be seen in us? Yes. Because if we truly love God, what did Jesus say? If you love God, what are you going to do? You're going to keep His commandments. You're going to do His will. Well, if we truly love our fellow man, we're not going to do anything to harm our fellow man because our desire is goodwill. Our desire is to see the good in that person and to try to bring out the good in that person. Because our desire is to lead them to Christ. So any questions or comments up to this point? Okay. Well, let's move now down into this next section. I think we've got time to at least start discussing this. Let's look at verses 11 down through the end of the chapter. Paul says, "And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." So notice that he says, this is not something you need to put off. This is not something that you need to continue to string along and say, well, you know what, I'll do this later on. I'll take care of this later in life. Well, I know I have a problem with this, but I'll take care of this problem later. Yes, we all kind of fall prey to that from time to time. I think probably all of us have a little bit of a natural proclivity to procrastinate in certain areas. We may look at certain things as being less important as other things that are out there. And so even though I know this is something I need to do, I just don't want to deal with it today. I'm going to push this off down the road. Well, notice what Paul says. He said, this is high time. This is the time to do it. Right now. He says, wake up. Wake up. Realize that your salvation, and when he uses this terminology, your salvation, he's talking about the day of judgment. He said the day of judgment is even closer now than it was when you became a Christian. The day of judgment is even closer now than it was when you first learned that these things are in your life, but yet you keep putting it off further and further and further down the line. He says, wake up. Take care of the problems that are there. But look at the imagery that he uses. The night is far spent. Simply put, it's getting early in the morning. The sun's about to start rising. You know, a lot of times we find in the Scriptures our lifespan referred to in terms of day and night and light and dark and these different stages of life. He says, you know what? He says, there's some of you out there, he said, you know, you're well up into the night. You've wasted a lot of time.
On that 13 there, what does yours say? The old King James says, let us walk honestly.
Mine says walk properly.
Honestly, properly.
Yeah. You know, something that I always think about when I think about the subject we're discussing here, and I'll mention him by name. Everyone here knew him and loved him. Elton Fielden. You know, Elton did not become a Christian. I believe he was 75 years old when he obeyed the gospel. And so many times in the later years of his life, he told me how much he regretted the years he wasted. He said, I knew what I needed to do. He said, I knew that I needed to be in church. I knew that I needed to be a Christian. He said, but I just kept putting it off. And I think that there are probably a lot of other people as well that would fall into that same category. And so what Paul is saying, he says, if you're out there and you're engaging in these things, revelry and drunkenness and lewdness and lust and strife and envy, if you're out there and you're claiming to be a Christian, but yet you're still engaging in these sinful activities, you need to understand you're one day closer to death now than you were yesterday. You're one day closer to judgment than you were yesterday. You knew you needed to take care of this then. Why haven't you? Why didn't you take care of it? And so what Paul's trying to get them to say is, stop putting these things off. Stop giving in to the lusts of the flesh. Stop engaging in these things. Make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. What he's encouraging these people in Rome, don't give in to temptation. Don't give in to what your body tells you that you want to do, or even the things that your body tells you should do. Do those things that are in keeping with the will of God. And that draws us back to this concept. Let everything be based upon love. Love for God, love for your fellow man. If you will do that, then you're going to live a faithful Christian life. You're not going to be engaging in these sinful activities. But if you are, it's high time to make a change. It's high time to turn away from those things. All right, well, we're out of time, so we're going to stop there for this morning. Lord willing, next Sunday morning we'll start chapter 14.